He could move markets with a phone call, orchestrate billion-dollar mergers before his morning espresso. But when it came to feeding his own son a single bite, he was helpless. This isn't a story about money. It's about what money can't fix. It's about silence, not just the kind that lives in a courtroom or a lonely penthouse, but the silence between a father and the child he loves but cannot reach. And then, into that silence, stepped someone the world would call just a waitress. But she wasn't just anything. She saw what no one else did. And in doing so, she didn't just change one boy's life, she rewrote a father's soul. If you've ever overlooked someone or been the one overlooked, stay with us. This is a story about what happens when love speaks the language the world forgot to learn. He sat in a booth upholstered in deep burgundy velvet, the kind reserved for people who wore tailored suits and made impossible things happen with a signature. Marcus Whitfield was that man, CEO of Whitfield Industries, commander of 3 global sectors, architect of billion-dollar decisions. But tonight none of that mattered. Because across from him sat his 8-year-old son, Jamie, and the boy would not eat. A $200 lobster dish, hand-prepared by the executive chef, cooled untouched between them. Jamie rocked gently in his seat, his small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the polished mahogany table. His eyes never lifted. His lips never opened. And the judgment in the room? Palpable. Murmured voices. Stolen glances. The kind that asked, if you can't manage your own child, what exactly are you managing? Marcus leaned in jaw tight. Jamie, please. His voice was soft but not gentle, more a command disguised as a whisper. People are watching. But Jamie didn't respond. He was lost in a quieter world, one where restaurant lights were too bright, the jazz piano too loud, and expectations too heavy. In that moment, Marcus realized something terrifying. All his money, power, and strategic brilliance couldn't unlock the most basic human connection, with his own son. And yet, something was about to happen. Something small, quiet, and almost invisible. But it would shake the very foundation Marcus thought he stood on. Because sometimes, the person you least expect, the one society overlooks, sees the one thing you've been blind to all along. She approached their table without a sound, her apron perfectly pressed, her posture graceful but unassuming, like someone used to existing just outside the frame. Kesha Williams didn't interrupt. She didn't ask what the problem was or offer a chirpy, "How's everything tonight?" like the other servers had. Instead, she simply knelt beside Jamie's chair, not above him but beside him. And then, something unexpected happened. She hummed. A lullaby, not the sugary sweet kind sung in cartoons, but a melody woven with memory and care. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, but in a minor key. Slower. Softer. Like it had been cradled in silence before being released into the air. Jamie stilled. His fingers paused mid-pattern. His eyes, usually darting away from faces, glanced toward her, curious. Not frightened. Not overwhelmed. Just present. Kesha reached for a small piece of lobster, careful and slow. She didn't offer it directly, didn't break the spell. She mirrored his pattern instead, circling the food gently in the air, echoing the movement Jamie had traced onto the table. It was choreography. A silent duet. And then, without a single word exchanged, Jamie leaned forward and opened his mouth. One bite. Then another. Marcus watched, stunned. His phone, still lit with unread emails and stock updates, sat forgotten at his side. For the first time in years, his son wasn't retreating. He was here. Engaged. At peace. But what Marcus didn't yet know was who this woman truly was. Because Kesha wasn't just a waitress with a calming presence. She was someone with a past filled with children like Jamie. And though the world had tried to silence her, she had never stopped speaking the language only a few knew how to hear. Marcus returned the next evening. Not for the food and certainly not for the ambience he barely noticed either. He returned for her. Jamie sat beside him again, nervous at first, then calmer the moment Kesha appeared. It was as if her presence switched off the static in his son's mind. Once again she knelt gently, greeted Jamie with a quiet smile, and began that same humming lullaby. The boy leaned into her rhythm, his tiny hands now mirroring her movement. They were dancing again, this time in full harmony. After the third visit, Marcus found himself watching Kesha even after Jamie had eaten. How she moved between tables, how she gently touched a shoulder or offered a kind word without asking for anything in return. Who was she? One evening he caught her in a quiet moment at the back hallway. "You're really good with him," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Kesha looked up, then down. "I've had practice." He wanted to ask more. But something about the way she returned to folding napkins told him that this wasn't something freely given. What Marcus didn't know, what no one at the restaurant knew, was that Kesha spent her Saturdays in a rundown community center on the city's east side. A place with flickering lights and donated toys. A place where children like Jamie came not for lobster but for language, taught not with textbooks but with patience. It was there, quietly and without compensation, that she continued doing what the system had taken from her. Teaching special needs children how to be heard in a world that rarely listened. 10 years ago she had been the director of a thriving learning center. 10 years ago she believed passion was enough. Until Marcus Whitfield's company, seeking to trim inefficiencies, cut the funding that kept her doors open. And now fate had brought him back into her life, not as a corporate signature, but as a father, desperate for help, unaware of the bridge he once burned. She never told him. Because Kesha wasn't looking for revenge. She was too busy doing what she'd always done, seeing the child others overlooked and loving him anyway. For weeks Marcus kept returning. Not because he had to, but because, for the first time, he wanted to. Dinners with Jamie were no longer silent struggles. With Kesha nearby, his son would hum softly while eating, even offer small gestures, reaching for a napkin, making eye contact, brushing his father's hand with quiet trust. Marcus began learning too. How to lower his voice. How to match Jamie's rhythm rather than fight it. How to pause before speaking, not to command but to connect. But the world outside their quiet corner booth didn't understand what was happening. Whispers grew louder. Patrons complained about disruptive children. A photo of Marcus, Jamie, and Kesha laughing together made its way onto a gossip blog. Billionaire's new muse? The CO, the child, and the waitress. The headlines were cruel. But the real storm came from someone who hadn't been seen in over 2 years. Margaret Sinclair. Jamie's mother. Once the perfect wife for a man like Marcus, graceful, polished, and ambitious, she had left when the family portrait began to crack. Jamie's diagnosis had been inconvenient. Too emotional. Too complicated. From her penthouse in Monaco, Margaret scanned the tabloid images and smiled coldly. Inappropriate, she muttered. Unstable. And incredibly useful. She called her attorney over champagne. He's parading our son around with a waitress. Let's file for full custody. This is the leverage I've been waiting for. And just like that, what began as a quiet miracle turned into a legal war. The accusation was sharp. Marcus was emotionally negligent and exposing his child to an unstable environment. His growing closeness with Kesha was framed as dangerous. But behind the press releases and polished statements, the truth was much quieter. Kesha was the only person who had seen Jamie. Who understood him. Who had helped Marcus rediscover the one thing he'd forgotten in his climb to the top. How to be human. Now that fragile progress was under attack. And Marcus would soon face the very system he once helped break. Only this time he was fighting for more than numbers, he was fighting for his son. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, cameras, curious onlookers. All waiting to see a billionaire brought to his knees by scandal. Margaret sat poised at the plaintiff's table, every hair in place, her suit a carefully calculated shade of sympathy. She looked the part of the concerned mother. Marcus, in contrast, looked tired. Not broken, but stripped of his usual armor. Beside him sat his legal team, confident in law, uncertain in emotion. But it wasn't Marcus who would decide the outcome. It was the woman they had all underestimated. Kesha Williams. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the witness stand. No designer dress. No polished speech. Just a quiet dignity that turned every head in the room. The opposing lawyer pounced first. Miss Williams, you are a waitress, correct? I serve food, yes, she replied calmly. And what qualifications do you have to interact with a child on the autism spectrum? Kesha didn't flinch. She turned slightly, catching Jamie's eyes in the back row. He offered her a shy smile, the kind only trust can earn. Then she spoke. My name is Kesha Williams. I have a master's degree in special education from Columbia. For nearly a decade, I ran a learning center that served children with autism, ADHD, and developmental delays. I trained teachers, counseled families, and watched children who were once labeled unreachable learn to speak, to love, to thrive. The room went still. I lost that job when the funding was cut. Funding that was withdrawn by Whitfield Industries. Marcus's head dropped. It was the first time he had heard the full truth. Kesha continued, her voice steady. I didn't come to this courtroom to defend myself. I came to speak for a boy who didn't have a voice. For months, Jamie sat in silence. Then one night he looked at me and said, Mama Kesha, hungry? He saw me not as a stranger, but as someone safe. She turned to Margaret. You want custody because it's convenient now. But love isn't a convenience. It's a choice. Every day. I didn't show up for headlines or paychecks. I showed up because that child needed someone to kneel, not tower. To listen, not lecture. To speak his language even when the world forgot it existed. She paused. If that makes me unfit, then perhaps it's the system that needs rethinking. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was reverent. Even the judge seemed to exhale slower. Marcus looked at her not with power, not with pity, but with gratitude so deep it bordered on awe. In that moment, Kesha wasn't just a witness. She was the only one in the room who had already done the work the rest were arguing about. And now, finally, the world had to listen. The judge's ruling came swiftly but not without gravity. Jamie would remain in his father's care. But under one condition, that his environment be built around understanding, not convenience, love, not pride. A professional care plan, family therapy, consistent support, all guided by someone who could truly see him. Marcus didn't argue. He nodded, not with defeat but with reverence. For the first time in years, he understood that being a parent wasn't about control. It was about presence. Outside the courthouse, Kesha sat on the stone steps, her hands folded in her lap, not triumphant, but exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes after carrying a weight no one else saw. Marcus joined her silently. The city bustled around them, but for a moment, there was only stillness. I'm sorry, he said at last. Not just for the courtroom, but for the school. For the years you lost. For not seeing sooner. Kesha looked at him, not with resentment but with quiet knowing. You can't give me those years back, she said. But you can honor them. And the children still waiting to be seen. He didn't hesitate. I want to rebuild the center. Under your direction. No budget limits. No red tape. Just your vision, pure and whole. Kesha blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Why? Because Jamie isn't the only child like him, Marcus said. And you're not the only person the world forgot to listen to. Months later, the doors to the Whitfield Foundation for Neurodevelopmental Support opened in the same building where her old learning center once stood. The walls were repainted, but the mission was unchanged, to see the children no one else could. Marcus visited often, not as a CEO but as a father learning a new language. He no longer barked instructions. He hummed softly beside Jamie when the world became too loud. He learned how to wait, to whisper, to witness. One afternoon, Jamie handed Marcus a drawing. 3 figures under a sky full of stars. Me, he said, pointing. Daddy. Mama Kesha. Marcus looked at Kesha, emotion tight in his throat. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Because some truths are too deep for words. And some families are not born but built, patiently, tenderly, through the courage to finally see each other. On the foundation wall hung a small plaque. Read. In memory of the children the world forgot, and in honor of those who refused to. Love didn't save just Jamie. It saved a father. It revived a dream. And it reminded the world that sometimes, the ones we ignore, are the ones holding the key to everything we've been missing. Sometimes, the loudest transformations begin in silence. In the quiet hum of a waitress's lullaby. In the stillness of a father finally learning to listen. In a child's first whispered word after years of silence. This wasn't just a story about autism. It was about dignity rediscovered, love redefined, and the profound power of seeing what the world so often overlooks. If this story touched something in you, share it. Because somewhere, someone is still waiting to be seen. And perhaps like Marcus, like Jamie, like Kesha, we all just need one person who refuses to walk away. Yellowheart, thank you for watching, and for believing in stories that heal. Don't forget to like, comment, and follow for more moments that remind us what truly matters.